Hey everybody, how's it going? So, since a lot of you are writing up your final paper on the ethnographic study of self, finishing up adolescence was my goal here, and a lot of stuff with the biology, um, brain development, things with nutrition, acne, some of the things that come up in adolescence. So, cramping during menstruation. This is um, from 13 to 19 on through um, sleep. You still need like 9.25 hours. So, that's why someone argued you do not want to start school so early, or why some struggle in school super early. Um, They're in the theorist Piaget's formal operational stage. So that means you could have abstract thought, some hypothetical deductive reasoning, other possibilities like hypothesis testing, future thought. You can think about your thoughts. So, like starting philosophizing and then expansion of thought. My late adolescence, 60% use formal operations. And that is something that comes up a lot. Um, and some question if it is a universal stage of adolescence. It's something that also comes up. Um, so, with communication, they'll use even metaphors, satirical labels. The writing is more meaningful. They might even keep a journal. As a counselor, you'll have confidentiality issues, and social workers need to understand that the social and legal aspects of communicating consent and confidentiality to adolescents. You know, when you're saying everything's confidential except if you're a harm to self or others, um, and keeping that confidence, and then if they're brought in by their parents, a dialogue with what they'd like shared from their parents to their parents, etc., etc. Some attitudes, storm and stress myths. So the self-esteem, they have lowest point in early adolescence. You'll get that at 15, 16, 17. Most emerge from adolescence with the same amount of self-esteem they had at the beginning. So it'll go down and then come back up as you're like learning to become really fully independent. And then that goes through college. You're learning to become self-supporting. There's mood swings, greater highs and lows than adults. With foster care, there's low self-esteem related to multiple placements sometimes and the time in foster care. And that's why we watch a lot of those foster care videos. Um, Identity and interdependence. So, like connectedness, adolescence, respect, and openness to others' views, connectedness to parents promotes individuation and identity development. The individuation is autonomy, so separateness and self assertion. Separateness is the expression of the individual's distinct self from others. Self assertion refers to adolescents' expression to their viewpoints. Um, with Hispanic adolescents, they're more like interdependence than independence. Um, the example is their family commitment. So a lot more church stuff and taking care of youngers. Egocentrism. So you've got the egocentric thought, preoccupation with thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Self consciousness. Um, is the Erickson stage. Some teens will fight with their parents as if there's an imaginary audience watching them. Um, Personal fables. So with psychological strengths and hazards, we have the adolescent mental health disorders. So internalizing problems, that's depression. So suicide is the third leading cause of death. The average onset of depression is 13 to 15 years of age. And then those externalizing problems, 25% referred for delinquency and conduct problems. So delinquency, normative, it peaks around age 16, higher in boys and ethnic minorities. Younger delinquents are riskier. At Lighthouse, we had a homeless shelter for 13 to 16-year-olds. It says when deviant behavior occurs at early ages, the problem is seen as conduct disorder. Family interventions and social skills training are most effective treatments. So at Claremont Recovery Center, we did what was called multidimensional family therapy. So you could look that up if you wanted to cite it for your final paper. MDFT was kind of a holistic approach to counseling. So the social dimension, family, there's 3 developmental tasks for the family. There's autonomy development, resolve parent-adolescent conflict, establish parent-adolescent attachment. Then there's peer pressure and conformity that peaks in early adolescence. Conformity can be positive and negative. So maybe they have kids that love sports and studying all the time so they get good grades. Friendships, there could be intimacy, loyalty, trust, and commitment. Intimacy in friendships refers to the sharing of personal thoughts. Also, social workers can help with identity and even sexual and emotional development. The peer groups are cliques or crowds, teaching social skills. It involves active group member participation at each step. Some get involved in gangs, so delinquency differentiates gangs from other peer groups. Risk factors could be if there's poverty and little attachment to people or social institutions. Also, adolescents have a developmental need to associate with peer groups. Most members are 14 to 18 years old, can go as old as 30. So it depends on, who gets in trouble, who might get caught, and who still benefits from being involved. Female gang involvement is reported by law enforcement agencies to be about 6 to 8%. So it's a lot lower. Developmental mismatch in the transition from elementary to middle school. As poor goodness of fit, so it could be a small school to large, impersonal and bureaucratic school. You could go from the top dog to being the bottom dog, or small fish in a big pond or big fish in a small pond. Shift in peer groups, puberty, and concerns about body image. So maybe working out or even eating disorders come up, even exercise bulimia, decreased dependency on parents, and then high school dropouts. So social dimension of homelessness, characteristics of runaway or throwaway youth. As I mentioned before, Lighthouse had a homeless shelter for 13 to 16-year-olds. Physically or sexually abused in the home in year previous to homelessness is common. Substance dependence, criminal activity, and or thoughts of suicide. And then approximately 2 million youth are homeless, according to the Housing and Urban Development from like 5-6 years ago. Social dimension, adolescence of color, and ethnic identity relates to a stronger sense of purpose, self-confidence, and social competence. The author says minority youth often confront living in 2 different cultures, the dominant culture and a culture shaped by their ethnic or racial status. Adolescents of color often have 2 sets of peer relationship, one at school and another in their neighborhoods. And then immigrant adolescents must address the issue of belonging versus estrangement. And that's critical to their adjustment, is reliance in their earlier primary groups' cultural values, which can provide a foundation for their adjustment. With gender roles, there is a shift towards androgyny lately, greater diversity in gender roles, and an increasing emphasis on equality or role sharing. Adolescent girls' development. What on the way of womanhood does a girl have to give up? That was a book by Lynn Michael Brown, Meeting at the Crossroads. And the most significant factor related to depression is body image. Sexuality, so a broad term including all of our sexual thoughts, feelings, values, beliefs, and relationships. Also, sexual behavior, just the behavior including holding, and then sexual identity, a major development of tasks in adolescence. Some sexual activity, so oral sex over 40%, both boys and girls report having received oral sex. Adolescent rationale, it's not as special, or they're still a virgin, etc. Sexual identity, so some LGBTQIA youth, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and then questioning. In teens disclosing their homosexuality with increasing regularity and doing so at a younger age, about 3% to 4% of the adult population identifies as gay or lesbian in 2015, or transgender. And when one twin is gay, this shows the genetic connection. The other is gay more than 50% of the time. So 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide with the mental health disorders there. 80% of adolescent boys and girls report being sexually harassed by peers. So wanted to get this in on adolescence for you guys to finish up.
In our exploration of how the mind grows, we've talked about a lot of different philosophies and models and ways of looking at things. But here's a surprisingly useful tool for understanding developmental psychology: The Breakfast Club. This video, by the way, will contain Breakfast Club spoilers. That classic 80s movie about a band of teenagers stuck in detention one fateful Saturday morning. Do they do Saturday detentions anymore? That was never a thing in my school. That was crazy, the idea that kids would come in on a weekend for detention. You got the hoodlum, the jock, the nerd, the princess, and the so-called basket case. And at first, they're all salty and standoffish with each other because, let's face it, American high schools are sort of a breeding ground for that kind of thing. But as the day progresses, they start to open up and share things and have a little fun by way of a dance montage. And at some point, they each kind of crack, revealing something very important about adolescence in the process, which is the struggle between the need to stand out and the need to belong. All these kids feel tremendous pressure to maintain their image in their particular group, in part because there's just some security in belonging to a group, even if that group gets picked on by another group. And so they wear the corresponding diamond earrings, combat boots, letterman's jackets, and spectacles, and act how their roles dictate. The thing is, none of those kids are satisfied with their outward identities. Instead, they're all stuck in the classic teenage struggle, one that German psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, yes, his name was actually Erik Erikson, called the crisis between identity and role confusion. In other words, their newly forming identities were at odds with other people's expectations of what roles they should play. Hence the confusion. The past couple of weeks, we've been talking about childhood as a crucial period of growth, learning, and change, and it definitely is. But anyone who's ever seen a John Hughes movie knows that there's way more to growing up than just that. And I got some news for you. From adolescence into adulthood and into old age, the drama of your personal psychological development never ceases. Never. So get used to it. Today, most psychologists view our psychological development as a lifelong process. From infant to adolescent to adult to card-carrying senior citizen, people keep right on changing. Just as Piaget gave us a helpful framework for thinking about early development, other scholars have given us ideas about how we develop through the rest of our lives, particularly Erik Erikson. Like many others, Erikson believed our personalities develop in a predetermined order, which he outlined in an 8-stage model. And each stage from infancy to old age is defined by its own predominant issue or crisis. If it freaks you out to think that you will always be dealing with a crisis at every stage of your life, we can just call them issues. Since we already talked a lot about early childhood development, I'm going to skip ahead to the teenage meat of it, but you can consult this table to learn about the rest. Erikson defined the adolescent years, or stage 5, as starting in our teens and extending for some as far as our early 20s. And as the Breakfast Club so artfully depicted, its main crisis is the one of identity versus role confusion. Teen years are marked by lots of physical changes in the body and brain and sex hormones, along with the growing independence, but also a real need to belong to something. This often angsty time is when teens re-examine their identities, figuring out how to both blend in and how to stand out. often by trying on different roles. Maybe they're experimenting with punk rock or hockey or theater or ancient philosophy. Maybe sophomore year, they're preppy, junior year, they've got green hair. Hopefully a person comes out of the stage with a reintegrated sense of self, but this stage can be particularly confusing, as I'm sure anybody watching this video can attest to. But of course, that's not the last crisis. Sorry. Issue. Erickson believed that young adulthood, which in his view started in a person's 20s and ended as late as the early 40s, was marked by another struggle, one between intimacy and isolation. At this stage in life, most of us have begun exploring intimate relationships, whether that's a steady sweetheart or just an active OkCupid profile. A good relationship here can lead to feelings of safety and caring and commitment, while a lack of intimacy can lead to loneliness and isolation and depression. Recently, a number of psychologists have begun to refer to the first few years of this stage as emerging adulthood, and some suggest that it warrants its own classification distinct from adolescence or full adulthood. And at least in modern Western culture, many people in this stage do feel like they're stuck in a sort of in-between time. They know that they've pulled through all that high school stuff, but they're still pretty tied to their families. In 2011, the US Census found that 65% of people under 24 still live with their parents. Just a reminder of how things like economic factors can weigh on development. For Erickson, after young adulthood came the middle adulthood of our 40s to 60s. This stage, stage 7, highlights our tendency toward either generativity or stagnation. By now, many people have established jobs or careers or perhaps families of their own. We better understand the bigger picture of life and contribute to society through productive or generative activities like work, community involvement, raising kids, paying taxes, all that grown-up stuff. The lack of those things, an overall boredom or absence of purpose, can make stage 7ers feel stagnant and unproductive, hence the often cliched but really real and potentially painful midlife crisis. And finally, at the end, comes stage 8. In our late adulthood, from 65 and up, we often struggle with integrity versus despair. Maybe you've hung out with a grandparent or some other senior and heard them contemplating their lives and accomplishments and reminiscing about how cheap a milkshake used to be. Well, if their overall vibe is positive, they've probably developed a sense of integrity and completeness, meaning they're pretty satisfied with a life well lived. The flip side of that is looking back on life and feeling guilt and regret. And that kind of retrospective disappointment can ruin old age with depression and feelings of hopelessness. Again, Erickson's model isn't really a perfect contemporary one, but it gave us an early idea of conflict and growth over our whole lives. His ideas have been developed further and even challenged by other scholars, but like Piaget, he remains a crucial figure to know in Western psychology. So Erickson tackled our progressive psychosocial development, but what exactly happens to our bodies and brains after we hit adulthood and keep racking up the birthday cake candles? It's hard to generalize these stages of adulthood because we don't really hit yearly milestones like we did when we were kids, and adult lifestyles can vary a whole lot. I mean, in a lot of ways, 70-year-old Mick Jagger is still living a younger lifestyle than a lot of 20-somethings I know. But despite all our differences, many of our life forces do have some similarities, physically, cognitively, and socially. First, there are, yes, physical changes. The slow decline of reaction time, muscle tone and strength, cardiac output, sex hormone production, and sharpness of senses like hearing and sight. For most of us, bifocals are inevitable, and perhaps hearing aids as well. None of this is to say that a jacked 50-year-old couldn't beat a lazy 20-year-old on a 100-meter dash, because of course how well you take care of your body counts for a lot, but still, you can't stop, let alone reverse the process of aging. The good news is our intelligence remains pretty stable throughout adulthood. Although some people might feel that their wits get a bit fuzzy with age, research suggests that while one kind of intelligence decreases after adolescence, another kind keeps increasing throughout your lifetime. Psychologists Raymond Cattell and John Horn were the first to develop the concepts of fluid and crystallized intelligence, suggesting that intelligence itself is made up of different abilities that work together. Fluid intelligence deals with your ability to solve problems independent of your personal experience and education. It's typically associated with thinking both quickly and abstractly, like teasing out the logic of a puzzle rather than remembering how to find the cosine of an angle. So relatively inexperienced teens often show high fluid intelligence. The bummer is, it peaks in adolescence, then typically starts its slow decline in the 30s. So I'm experiencing that now. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, is just what it sounds like. Knowledge that's based on facts, solidified by past experiences and prior learning. This type of experiential intelligence gets stronger with age as we continue to take in new knowledge and understanding, and it's part of why grandmas are so good at crossword puzzles. So fluid and crystallized intelligence are equally important on any given day, and ideally they work together to get the job of thinking done. So in the end, some of our thinking gets rusty with age, but some of it keeps getting better. Of course, There are exceptions. While most people who live into their 90s are still pretty sharp, some will experience a substantial loss of brain cells and suffer serious consequences. Brain tumors, small strokes, or continued alcohol dependence can all progressively damage the brain, increasing the risk of dementia. Dementia isn't a specific disease, but rather a set of symptoms related to impaired thinking, memory loss, confusion, and potential changes in personality that become severe enough to interfere with regular functioning. Alzheimer's disease is a form of progressive, irreversible dementia. First, memory declines, then reasoning, and then eventually basic physiological functions as vital brain neurons continue to deteriorate. It strikes about 3% of the world's population before age 75, although from there, the rate roughly doubles every 5 years. But again, not all dementia is related to Alzheimer's disease, nor is it as extreme, and while the risk of dementia certainly increases in older adults, it's important to remember that it is not part of normal healthy aging. Some memory changes are normal, but most memory should remain intact. In the end, we still have a lot to learn about the aging process. As our lifespans continue to get longer, we might need to tweak what we think we know about its effects on human psychology. In some ways, you might say that this is psychology's next frontier. By the time we figure out what that looks like, the cast of The Breakfast Club might just be ready for a reunion. They better make a movie about it. Today, your developing brain learned about Erikson's 8 stages of progressive psychosocial development and their accompanying issues. You also learned about emerging adulthood, the differences between fluid and crystalline intelligence, and some facts about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make this possible. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Gale, edited by Blake DiBastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor is Michael Miranda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
All right, so
Looks kind of done
as you
on
can
that.
see with adolescence, there is a lot of info to absorb and a lot of things to have going on. There is nowadays cyberbullying, so over half the adolescents have been bullied online. That's one of the things that comes up. Cell phones and the internet. Over half the young people do not tell their parents about this experience. It could be annoying or embarrassing or any of the above with that. And then the most common form of cyberbullying occurs through instant messaging. Most of the victims are in middle school. So one of the things you'll take up to deal with as a social worker. Also, the last few slides here, adolescent risk behaviors like substance use, there's greater violence, schools and dating relationships at home. After school programs are associated with improved school performance. Also, sometimes working 15 to 20 hours a week improves a student's self-esteem and school satisfaction. And working on a student's GPA, and the average is higher. I even noticed that in both high school and college. I worked and did better in school when I worked. More than 20 hours a week has a negative effect, though, and that's true. When I picked up more hours, it was hard to get the schoolwork done. Adolescent pregnancy, that's a big one. Every year, the U.S. has one of the highest teen birth rates of all developed countries. 6% of all women aged 15 to 19. 1 out of 3 have a repeat pregnancy within 2 years. The historical trend is that U.S. teen pregnancy rate has been declining continuously over the past 20 years. Birth rates are higher among Hispanic and Black adolescents compared to the white adolescents. Big risk factor is poverty there. Some of the consequences of the pregnancy, though, the infant, short term, they have low birth weight or even infant mortality. Long term, the book says less education, behavioral and emotional issues with teen pregnancy, poverty. With the mother, short term, birth complications and mortality. Long term, less education, lower socioeconomic status, and welfare dependency. Also, more unstable relationships and more unintended births. Father, short term, more involved than in the past, but tapers after the first year, and face hostility from mothers and not decision makers. Also, the long term is that they could come up more often with low paying jobs. So, last slide. So, with sex education, prevention of adolescent pregnancy is big. Abstinence only programs fail to educate sexually active students about responsibility, which could be even using a condom, even having birth control so you don't get pregnant. Final slide is about alcohol and drug use. So majority of high school students report having consumed alcohol. That's almost 2/3. Binge drinking is decreasing for 12th graders, so 17%. 3 factors differentiated problem drinkers from other adolescents. And this is in Jesser's problem behavior theory you see in the book. Personal qualities, social environment, and other patterns of behavior. And then the effective intervention programs, I'd say MDFT I mentioned earlier is one, DARE is not. Research shows DARE is not. And then effective prevention is strengthening protective factors while reducing risk factors that increase vulnerability to drug use. So those are some of the ideas for the ethnographic study that could come up for your final paper. I wanted to get through those. So if you were to cite even that YouTube video is a possibility. And again, thank you all for a good class, and reach out with questions if you have them. And we'll definitely see you all soon.